histology, for whatever reason, is somewhat hidden to the majority of people, right? It's this what not well understood kind of
Yep.
black box that
Hmm.
produces the slides that pathologists work on. And so I think it's a area that has not gotten the attention it deserves in terms of, hey, we have these tools that we can offer the people today that are going to impact their lives and help them do their jobs in a better way. We just need to kind of get the tool out there and say, hey, is this working for you? Is this going to, drive value for you in your lab?
Welcome to the People of Pathology podcast. I'm Dennis Strank. On this podcast, we explore pathology, laboratory medicine, forensic science, and innovations in these fields. The process of specimen grossing is still largely dependent on people. This leaves it open to human error, rare as it may be. But what if there was a way to augment this process and eliminate human error? Jacob Guggenheim is head of engineering at Vistapath. Today, we'll talk about how the Sentinel uses AI to improve accuracy in specimen grossing. Okay, let's get into it with Jacob Guggenheim. Now, the place I want to start with you is your path to Vistapath. Tell us a little bit about what your background is, and then how that led you to join Vistapath.
Sure. So if we're gonna start at the beginning, we can start at the beginning. So I'll rewind all the way to my kind of childhood, a somewhat naive interest in becoming a doctor and MD. And I was kind of on this path. And then in high school, I joined a robotics team on a spur of the moment decision. And this is through an organization called First Robotics. Highly recommended if you're interested in this and you're kind of growing up as a kid. And it really found my passion. I was like, oh, this is what I was meant to do. I love robotics. I love the kind of real world application and the real world, the physical manifestation of the problem solving that you're doing. And so I decided in college that I was going to split the difference between my initial interest in kind of being a doctor and being an engineer and go into bioengineering. I did that, ended up in grad school at MIT, and decided as I was applying to grad school that I really wanted to be more heavily involved in the robotics side rather than bioengineering, which is more of an attempt to split the difference. But still retained that interest in healthcare. And so wanted to apply robotics to healthcare. How do we kind of use this thing that I'm passionate about to improve the healthcare system or the lives of our patients? And I was lucky and kind of very fortunate to be introduced to Tim, who's the co-founder of Vistapath, during my time in grad school. And I had this conversation with him that I distinctly remember, and he may as well, where he asked me for some advice on kind of Vistapath and how to get started. He's working on like computer vision applications to automate gross reports. And I gave him some probably pretty bad advice, said, great, I will, obviously not purposely, said, I'll never see that guy again, and walked away. And a year later, he came back and said, hey, I have some funding. I'd love for you to come work for me and help me build this. And I came back and got to see, kind of why Vistapath was kind of in many ways that trifecta for me. It has this real world positive impact, which is what I was seeking. It has, a not easy but achievable goal. And it's an application of an expertise that I've been building over many years. And so getting to tour a histology lab with Tim, getting introduced to the histology space and seeing how valuable the skill set I could bring would be and how impactful the problem we're trying to solve at Vistapath could be really sold me on joint. A lot of credit, frankly, to Tim to help me graduate as quickly as I did from grad school. I was really, really pumped to get out of grad school and start with Vistapath. I defended on a Thursday. I started on a Tuesday and got going.
Okay, that's an interesting story, and I have a few questions about it. But so you were basically involved with Vistapath from the beginning, right? Or
Uh,
almost from the beginning.
yeah. So pre-funding, and I was working as a contractor while I was also doing grad school and trying to balance both. And then at some point I realized I just need to graduate and go here full time.
And the other part of this is because you have a background in bioengineering. I feel like these days in pathology, but I think in medicine as a whole, that's a good combination, the kind of healthcare aspect and the bioengineering aspect, because there's so much overlap there now. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. I think the bioengineering background, I have a lot of thoughts on bioengineering, and we can go into this as a separate conversation. But the kind of brief summary of that would be, at least when I was going to school, and it may have changed in the last 10 years, bioengineering was a very new field. And so it was trying to understand what it could become, and it introduced you to a lot of different fields. And so the value of this is that it kind of lets you dip your toe in a lot of different places, kind of learn and become an expert, or, at least an introduction, not an expert, but at least an introduction in a lot of places. And so when you're introduced to a new field like pathology or histology, you have relevant experience, but you also have the kind of built up skill set to dive deep very quickly because you've done it so many times before. And so bioengineering in that way helped me kind of build the muscle that is required to like rev up in a new space quickly.
Okay, that's interesting. I want to get a little bit deeper into the robotics part because, okay, well, this is kind of a tangent, but I think it sounds cool. So you did some work at MIT with robotic limbs, and tell me about this because I want to get into first what it is, and then is that relevant to what you're doing with Vistapath?
Yes, absolutely. So the professor I worked with, the way grad school works in engineering and robotics is you join a particular professor's lab. So I joined a lab by Professor Harry Asada over at MIT. And he at the time was exploring what he called supernumerary robotic limbs or super limbs. You'll probably hear me say one of the two. You could also say SRLs, which is just a shortening of that. And in research, this is kind of an aside, but there's often a balance between kind of short-term real world usefulness and then having a nice platform to kind of study longer term impactful strategies. I would say, kind of unsurprisingly, given where I ended up, I'm excited about the short-term usefulness side of this. I'm an engineer at heart. I want to see stuff working. I want to see stuff out in the real world having an impact. I'm less of a scientist. I'm not somebody who's interested in like, maybe in the future this might be valuable. I want to see how it's valuable now. And so as I joined the lab and they were kind of working on super limbs, a lot of the work that had been done to date was on the building of these systems. And so, we said, okay, can we build a system that attaches to the waist of a user and helps them balance? Can we build a system that attaches to the wrist of a user and helps them grasp objects if they've like suffered a stroke and lost functionality in one of their hands? And these were kind of really fantastic examples of the power of superlimbs, but what they didn't really consider at the time was the impact on the human. And so that's where I came in. That's what I studied was kind of how does the human control the limbs? What is the impact of wearing the limbs on the human? Are there reaction forces on the human that we can take advantage of? How do we, develop smart control strategies to leverage both the capacity of the human to control the system, like literally move in space, but also the kind of degrees of freedom that the robot offers so that we can kind of have a system that is greater than the sum of its parts. And so my work very much attempted to answer these type of questions. And then to the final part of your question, is this relevant to Vistapath? Yes, there's some core technical competencies that we built or I built over time. So, working with real-time sensors, computer vision, all of that kind of stuff is stuff we've applied at Vistapath as well. But beyond that, I think the thing I was just talking about, which is considering the human operator. The Vistapath Sentinel, as I'm sure we'll get into, is at its core an augmentation device. And so it's not trying to replace the human user, it's trying to work with the human. And so when I worked in grad school to understand how we could kind of leverage the capacity of the human and the robot to solve a problem together, we're doing many of the same things at Vistapath. How can we use the Vistapath Sentinel plus the user to kind of solve the problem of grossing?
Okay, that's interesting. And that's got to be kind of exciting for you to be able to apply what you learned previously to what you're doing now.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I referred earlier to Vistapath as a kind of holy trinity or trifecta for me, right? Real-world application of the kind of knowledge I have. This was exactly that.
Okay. So, all right, let's get into more about Vistapath now. Can you give sort of an overview, like what is the mission of Vistapath?
So it's helpful to start with a story here. So I'll start with a story, and this is a real-world story from Tim's lab and Tim's background. There was a 40-year-old guy out there. He had suspicion of prostate cancer. And so, as I'm sure you know more than I do, what happens here is they take a biopsy of your prostate and they send it off to a lab for diagnosis. Diagnosis comes back, it's cancer. And so on the basis of this, they actually remove the guy's prostate and send that prostate back to the lab as a standard procedure. They subsequently find no cancer in the prostate. This is obviously problematic. It turns out what happened was that this person's sample was swapped with a different patient in the histology lab. And so that means that this 40-year-old guy got an incorrect diagnosis of cancer. And then the other side of this is an 80-year-old guy who didn't get the diagnosis of cancer. He didn't until several months later. So this is a true story. I've obviously, anonymized some of it. But Tim was running the lab where this mistake happened. And he had the privilege, I'm using that word very loosely, of talking with the families of the people who were impacted by this mistake. And they basically asked of him, can you make sure that this doesn't happen again? And he said, well, given the existing tools we have, no, right? That's really, really hard. Histology, as I'm sure you're aware, is a very, especially grossing where this error happened, is a very manual labor process. And it's one that has not changed in 40 years, right? It's very similar. And we don't provide, frankly, the people who are doing this work many tools to be successful. And so he left his job running labs and started Vistapath so that he could kind of build a tool to help make the place where this happened, grossing, kind of more efficient and less error prone, give these people the tools they deserve to do their job better and faster.
I see. So that's a very, for Tim anyways, it's a very personal mission.
Yeah, and I think that's true throughout, Vistapath. So we have a few folks at Vistapath who have backgrounds in histology and pathology, and that really drives, kind of our direction as a company, right? This is not something where we're approaching this from the outside. We have people who have been working in this space for a long time who have been the drivers of like why we're here, what we're doing, and I think that's contributed to a lot of our success.
Can we talk about some of the sort of key technologies and innovations at Vistapath? And I know there's probably only so much of this you can talk about, proprietary things and things like this, but can we get into some of this?
Yeah, of course. So at least for me, and this is going back to probably my background in grad school, the core problem that we had to kind of first solve was like, how do you take the process of grossing and augment it? And so, what does the human do? And what does the computer or the robot or the kind of medical device that you're introducing do? So computers are really, really good at highly repetitive tasks. So if we want to do error checking, right, does the cassette match the vial? Does the vial match the case? Do both of them have all the same information at all times? This kind of error checking. So this is actually, let me rewind just a little bit. I referred earlier to an error that was made where prostate was incorrectly diagnosed. It was because somebody was grossing, and this was a fairly senior technician. She was tapped on her shoulders, my understanding, to help a more junior colleague, came back, forgot which case she was grossing, and put the tissue in the wrong set. And so, something as simple as, in that case, a system that constantly checks that all of the barcodes that are available to it are matching, right? All of that information we have is constantly from the same case, would have helped address this kind of issue. Or something, frankly, that kind of maintains some state and helps the person understand where they were in the process of grossing, right? So I want to emphasize and be really clear here. The person that made this mistake was a highly experienced technician who was helping another more junior colleague, right? This could not be more, at least to me, obvious of an example of the fact that the people who are doing this work need more tools, right? If we have our most experienced people making mistakes, then clearly we need to give them more help. And that is kind of what we're trying to do at Vistapath. So anyway, back to this question, kind of key technologies, key innovations. We're trying to augment the process. And the reason we've done that is because it allows us to enter into the field more quickly. We can, become a lower class in medical device, and we can solve the problem more effectively by relying both on the human and on the computer to solve the problem. Computers, as I said, are really good at highly repetitive tasks. We're also really good at computer vision. So if we want to do kind of an automatic generation of a gross report, we can do that through computer vision techniques that are being developed in other industries and bring them over to histology and apply them here. Humans are really, really good at tissue manipulation and dexterous tasks. That, something as simple for us as like taking some tweezers and moving tissue from point A to point B, that is a incredibly difficult robotics problem. And so rather than attempting to solve that problem from the, technology side, we can say, great, humans are really, really good at that. Humans are really, really good at common sense and kind of having an understanding of the broader task and what we're doing. And so let's apply the best of humans. Let's apply the best of the kind of robotic or computer vision or artificial intelligence technologies that we have and use them to solve this problem.
So, all right, two things I want to stress here. So when you're talking about the sort of the senior technician helping the more junior one, I can definitely relate to something like that. I mean, I've been around a little while, and, where I work, we have pathology residents. And so sometimes we're pulled away to help them. So I can understand the situation and how something like that could have happened. I mean, it makes sense. And the other part of it is you've said a couple of times, this is to augment the human. And so let's stress this. You're not replacing anybody. You still need the humans to, like you said, manipulate the tissue and use common sense and use their judgment. But the Sentinel is to help them do their jobs better.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the I'm emphasizing that both from a like technical feasibility perspective, but also because I genuinely believe it is the right way to solve the problem. Right? We could have as a company, Vistapath could have gone away and taken 15 years, 10 years, whatever it was, and a lot of money to try to automate this process. And I am guessing that what would have happened is we would have showed up 10 years later. At this point, hopefully somebody else has made a larger impact on the industry than we would, but we would have showed up 10 years later and we would have solved a portion of the problem and we would have done it poorly. So there's a idea that is prevalent within software engineering, and it's called agile development. And at the core of this idea is the fact that you want to iterate quickly, get something out, present it to your users, get feedback on how that is working, and then incorporate that feedback into your next design cycle. And so if we go home and we try to automate something, what's going to happen is 10 years pass, the industry has changed, we don't get feedback, we show up, the thing we produce kind of works, and we say, fantastic, we spent 10 years and $30 million and have something that works on 10% of your tissue that goes through your lab or something like that. Rather, we can take an approach where we say, we can get to the market much more quickly and we can get feedback much more quickly if we take an augmentation approach. And so not only does this allow us to, kind of is it an easier technical problem to solve if we rely on the human, but it allows us to develop a better solution quickly because we can get that feedback from the user more quickly.
Well, I think also you're getting feedback from the people actually using the machine or the device, whatever you want to call it.
Exactly right. So when I say user, I mean the histotechnician, right? It's the person who's day-to-day grossing, right? So we have at Vistapath, we have folks like Tim, who I've referenced a few times, who comes from a histology background, used to do this kind of work, ran a lab. But we have other folks like Matteo who have done that as well. Those are two examples of people. One of the things that has become really clear to me is histology labs are really diverse in how they operate. And so suggesting that we would have sufficient feedback just from the two people who are internal to our company and a few other people we talked to, a few other advisors, is obviously not right? We want to get a wide variety of feedback from very diverse labs. And the way we do that is we put it in front of people and we go to histotechs. We say, we want you to use this today, right? And the more you use it, the better it will become and the faster it will get there because you're the one who is driving this innovation cycle.
That makes a lot of sense to me. This is the People of Pathology podcast with our guest, Jacob Guggenheim. We'll be right back. If you think it would be nice to have a helpful reference about digital pathology, I have some great news for you. Dr. Alexander Zhurov has written a book called Digital Pathology 101, all you need to know to start and continue your digital pathology journey. This book will help you whether you're a complete novice or a digital pathology trailblazer. You can get a copy of it by following the link in the show notes. LabVine is an interactive online learning platform where laboratory professionals learn, develop, and discover by sharing knowledge and building on each other's experience. The platform provides global access to internationally accredited laboratory-specific courses and other resources developed by lab specialists like us for the laboratory industry. LabVine is free to sign up, and you can use the link in the show notes to get started. Now for the rest of my conversation with Jacob Guggenheim on the People of Pathology podcast. The Sentinel is one of the first, or it might even be the first instrument to apply AI to grossing specimens. Because from what I've seen anyways, until now, most of the AI applications, or almost all of them, in pathology have been to the microscopic part, kind of that part after grossing. And I'm curious then, so why is Vistapath focusing only on the grossing part?
Yeah, so it's twofold. One, I think it comes from kind of the background that we have. And the knowledge that, frankly, grossing is one of the areas, and we can pull up the papers if you'd like. It basically has the most manual labor and it's one of the largest source of errors in the histology process. And so if you're going to target any particular part of histology and try to say, can we improve this? Grossing is a fantastic place to start. I think the other side of this, perhaps, is that as somebody who didn't work on this as a career, kind of came into this more from the company and technology side, I was really, really familiar with perhaps the surgeon who takes the biopsy. I'm pretty familiar with the pathologist who reads a slide and renders the diagnosis. Histology, for whatever reason, is somewhat hidden to the majority of people, right? What not well understood kind of
Yep.
black box that
Hmm.
produces the slides that pathologists work on. And so I think it's a area that has not gotten the attention it deserves in terms of, hey, we have these tools that we can offer the people today that are going to impact their lives and help them do their jobs in a better way. And we just need to kind of get the tool out there and say, hey, is this working for you? Is this going to, drive value for you in your lab? The other thing that I want to point out in particular about grossing is that it's the gateway to the rest of the histology process, right? It's accessioning, grossing, and then the rest of the histology process. The information that we collect at grossing can be really, really impactful for all of the processes downstream. That's a kind of future conversation one I highly recommend you have with Tim, our co-founder. He can tell you a lot more about kind of the future plans of Vistapath with respect to that.
Okay, I like it. All right, so during your time at Vistapath and developing the Sentinel, there must have been some challenges in getting this product out. Can you talk about one or two of those? Like what have been sort of the most significant challenges, and then how did your team overcome them?
Yeah, so I'll talk about two, and I've kind of referred to them a bit already.
Okay.
So the first one is developing a computer vision algorithm. So let's talk a little bit about what that takes. I'm going to be very broad here, but there's two major kind of ideas behind computer vision algorithms. One is you do what I would call classical computer vision. So this has existed for a very long time, and it's not really data driven. You have some human like me who sits there and tunes an algorithm and basically like tries different techniques until something works, and it's somewhat qualitative, right? I'm basically looking and trying to understand if this is going to work. And then the other approach is the more modern approach, frankly, the better approach, which is far more data driven, right? So this is where I have some sort of machine learning model. I throw a bunch of annotated data at it. I say, learn some relationship here. And then I ask it to make inferences or predictions out of that and say, are you performing well? And if you're not, keep trying and keep training. The problem with that latter approach, that better approach, is you need a large amount of data to train that model in the first place. And one of the really interesting problems that we faced at Vistapath early on is the data set required these images of tissue in cassettes that we can then use to produce a gross report didn't exist. It's not like we didn't have it. My understanding is it did not exist. And so one of our first problems is to try to create this data set that we could build a model off of. And so the way we approached this problem was what's kind of sometimes called bootstrapping. We actually used pig analog tissue. And so we would go to a local butcher or something, we would get some pig fat and then kind of create mock tissue. And this is, I think, frankly, where Tim's experience was really, really valuable. He knew what looked like human tissue, he knew what didn't. And so he was able to kind of help us create tissue analogs through pig skin or something like that we could then use to kind of train the initial versions of this model. We were then able to go out to labs, demonstrate that we had the capacity to do this automatic production of the gross report. And that got us to get into some pilots, get into some agreements with these labs where we could actually start working with real data and train better models. And so kind of the initial process of getting this algorithm off the ground to the point where it was proof of concept successful was really, really challenging. And so the kind of use of a analog tissue to do that was, I think, a really good strategy for us at the time. The other kind of challenge that I want to talk about at Vistapath is, and I talked a little bit about this earlier as well, the differences in how lab A versus lab B grows. There is, as I said, a huge diversity here, and building a system that is flexible enough to kind of handle the different scenarios and the different ways different labs want to gross, while also providing the guardrails required so that we can kind of deliver on the improvement in quality that we pride ourselves on. It was really, really challenging. And it's something I think we continue to work on, but have done a good job to date. And then finally, just on security and compliance, we deal with protected health information. This is something we take really, really seriously. And so we spend a good amount of time hardening our systems. We're ISO 27001 compliant, which is a certification around this. So yeah, there's a lot of time spent ensuring that we are a well-hardened system that we can confidently go into a lab and say, we're going to protect the data that we are kind of operating on.
That's a very key point for sure. So let's flip this around then. So those are some of the challenges. Let's talk about an accomplishment, say that something that you're most proud of from your time at Vistapath.
Yeah, as I said, I'm an engineer. I love seeing this system in use. I love seeing it have an impact. And one particular impact that was really, really kind of impactful for me, or it was a proud moment for me, one of our earlier customers shared a story where she was grossing with the Sentinel and she got a note from a referent physician basically saying that they believed that the gross she had produced was inaccurate because they had sent more tissue than she had grossed. And as part of the grossing process with the Sentinel, we capture images of the kind of container, bird's eye view of the container, and we do that both before and after you gross. And so these images, as simple as they seem, are really, really impactful. And especially in this case. So this before grossing image, what it tells you is exactly what the referring physician or the hospital or whatever sent, right? This is the amount of tissue was in there. This is everything that was in there. And I can tell you exactly what was in there before I grossed it. And then the after image shows that I got everything out of that container or vial and of interest, right? And so I now have evidence, pictures and evidence that says, hey, look, this is what was sent to me. This is what I grossed. You can see images of the cassette as well. And so by kind of sharing this information with the referring physician, they were able to kind of deal with this discrepancy of understanding of what had been sent and what had actually been grossed. And it gave her the confidence that, and this is where I derive joy, gave her the confidence that the Sentinel was actually helping her, right? That Sentinel was helping her feel more confident as she grows, kind of hopefully relieving some of the stress. When you're the grossing technician, your name is on the line. You're the one who's signing and saying, I did this, and this is how I chose to gross. What we want to do is help them feel more confident in the thing they're producing. And these images are really, really a large step toward that.
Okay, I like that a lot. And I've definitely been in that situation just without the photographic evidence, which is a difficult place to be. But yeah. All right. Let's look a little bit to the future then. What do you, from your point of view, I guess, what do you see as the future of Vistapath, like kind of expanding the capabilities of the Sentinel or something like that?
Yeah. So there's the short answer here. And the long
Okay.
answer, I'm going to give you a short answer. And as I said, I really highly recommend having this conversation with Tim, one of our co-founders. He's
Yeah.
be a much better person to talk to about this. But there's kind of two facets to this. So one is we have an existing medical device. It works really, really well for grossing, but it works really well for grossing a subset of tissue. How can we expand that to help more of the tissue that comes in the lab be able to be grossed on our system? So that's really what we're working on right now. We're actually pretty close. I'm looking over to my right here because I have a mock-up or a model of our next kind of V2 of the system. So that's part one. And then part two is what I referred to earlier of grossing being the kind of gateway or entryway to histology. We think that the data that we collect here could be really, really impactful downstream. And this is driven not by our speculation, but rather by conversations with folks in the field, right? So people are asking us, hey, you have this data. Can you help us with processing? Can you help us with digital pathology? Can you help us with other processes later in the histology process? And the answer is yes. And so we're really, really excited about kind of taking the information that we gather during grossing and impacting downstream processes. But to do that, we really need every single tissue that comes through your lab to run on the Sentinel, right? That's how we're going to be most impactful, which comes back to this V2 version of the Sentinel that allows you to gross basically everything on it.
Okay, I love this. And yeah, the idea of pathology data being useful for other things. I mean, again, that's one of those things that's mostly been microscopic images until now, but there's a lot of information in a gross image too. And I've been wondering about that. How can that be used for other things? So I'm glad you're working on that. That's exciting.
Absolutely. And as I said, talk to Tim. He will help you kind of understand where the larger vision of Vistapath is and kind of where we're hoping to go.
All right. And I kind of want to end with sort of a more broader kind of question. Now you've got a background in bioengineering, and now you've got a pretty good handle on pathology and histology, I would say. So let's talk about then AI and kind of the future of pathology. How do you see AI kind of transforming the pathology in the future?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the first thing I want to emphasize is that it may not be the future, it's here now, right? So
Okay.
we're an AI-driven company, we're an AI-driven product. This is a tool that could be used today and should be used today and is used today in many labs. And so it's somewhat of this is a question of education and adoption, right? How do we help people understand what this is, why it should be used? The fact that, frankly, from my perspective, it's not that much different than anything else. It's a tool that can be useful to the person who is trying to do this job, right? We think about not to get too broad here, but like stuff like large language models, ChatGPT, Lambda, all these other large language models, these are tools, right? And in the same way that these are tools, the kind of computer vision that we've applied to this space is a tool that can be really, really valuable for a lab, for engrossing tech. And so it's here today. It's just a question of adoption and education about how to use it, how to find the right applications. The other part of this, though, and I think a really, really important part, if we talk about how do I see AI transforming pathology in the future, I guess a kind of variant of this question is like, what's the barrier to it being impactful in the future? And for me, the current bottleneck is a data bottleneck. What you often say about data-driven machine learning models is garbage in, garbage out. If you don't have a good data set, it does not matter how good you are at producing a model that you are trying to train a model, you are going to get a garbage result out. And so we need to work kind of collectively as a field to facilitate good data, getting to the people who can take advantage of it. This is a really challenging puzzle. And the reason this is a challenging puzzle is because this is protected health information, right? We can't be willy-nilly spreading this data around to folks who really should not have it. But at the same time, if we want to kind of create a nice industry wheel, so to speak, where we're actually kind of moving forward very quickly, we need to work on interoperability, making sure that the folks who have the data and the folks that can use the data all have access to it in a sane format, such that they can build algorithms, get them into the real world, see how they work, and then iterate down them very quickly. And so I not that I have the answer to this question, but how do we create the proper incentive structures such that these organizations benefit from working together while obviously protecting the very important data that they are working upon? So that's the kind of bottleneck that I see. If we solve it, I think artificial intelligence can be really, really impactful in histology. There's obviously examples like us today with computer vision being applied to grossing. There's many, many other examples all the way through the histology process that will give, I said earlier, I think histology is often an overlooked, for whatever reason, area of medicine. I think it's just not really something that most end user patients have to interact with. And so most people are not aware of it. If we can kind of break this data bottleneck and kind of get the wheels turning, we can bring the tools that exist in other areas like radiology, for example, to pathology, to histology, and really kind of drive forward innovation very quickly.
Okay, I love it. That's great. And I think you're right. Once the usefulness of technology like this becomes more widely known, it'll probably advance pretty quickly in the near future.
Yeah, I suspect it will. I think we're close. We just need a few good examples, get people to understand the value and the benefit and the way to do this safely. And that will help other companies kind of come up behind and enter the market and follow a kind of well-trodden path to impacting in a positive way histology.
Yep, I definitely agree. Jacob, this has been a real interesting conversation. I appreciate your time. Appreciate talking more about the Sentinel, which sounds fascinating. So Jacob Guggenheim, thank you very much.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
If you're looking for another episode of the People of Pathology podcast to check out after this one, here's a clip from my interview with Mateo Lopez as he talks about how he interacts with Vistapath customers to improve the Sentinel.
Essentially, it's a modern grossing station, but the difference is it has proprietary AI that can generate a gross description in less than a second. So, that to me makes it stand out quite a bit. On top of that, we offer quality in live images of the cassette, the container of the tissue that we put in the cassette, which this helps us address things like, if a clinician disagrees with the number of pieces in a container, or maybe what was labeled on the container. These are things, as far as some of the new things that it brings to the table. We have the ability to have these images of the container and of the cassettes to the pathologist, so they can see that on the report itself. And not only is it images, it's data, and it's data that is incredibly accurate and consistent.
You can hear more from Mateo Lopez in episode 177. All right, great big thanks to Jacob Guggenheim. Now, Jacob emphasized the importance of leveraging AI and computer vision technologies in pathology and histology to enhance processes and improve accuracy. We discussed how this technology can automate tasks in pathology, such as error checking during the grossing process. By implementing computer vision algorithms, the Sentinel can handle tasks like barcode matching and ensuring information consistency, thereby reducing errors and enhancing accuracy. It's important to highlight that the Sentinel is not intended to replace anyone. As Jacob said, humans are great at manipulating tissue, while computers are great at repetitive tasks. The purpose of the Sentinel is to augment the abilities of both. Jacob brought up another point that is worth revisiting. He said that one of the challenges to overcome in creating the Sentinel was the lack of a data set of gross tissue specimens, so they had to create their own. The rate at which AI is utilized in grossing is dependent on the availability of data. For an algorithm to be accurate, it needs a diverse set of data. This brings up something we've heard many times before on this podcast. This is the idea of embracing new technologies, such as this, and helping them develop. This also leads to a more diverse data set. Jacob talked about agile development, basically creating a product and using feedback from users to improve it quickly. That concept fits in here too. The point is not to just come up with new toys that we can use in the lab, as fun as that may be. If we're talking about increasing accuracy and efficiency, we're really talking about better patient care. And I think we'd all agree we should embrace that. If you want to learn more about the Sentinel, I'll have links in the show notes to that, as well as some of the other things that Jacob talked about today. Don't forget you can follow this podcast on Twitter and Instagram at People of Path, or just connect with me on LinkedIn. Thank you for continuing to share the show with others. Together, let's inspire the next generation of pathologists and laboratory professionals. This show is a member of Health Podcast Network. Thanks for listening. I'm Dennis Strank, and I'll talk to you next time on the People of Pathology podcast.